Chinese new energy vehicles, once considered a benchmark for exports, are facing significant challenges in Europe. On May 28, 2024, Great Wall Motors Germany GmbH announced the closure of its European headquarters, citing unprecedented policy difficulties and a less promising future. The situation escalated quickly. On June 12th, the European Commission announced that without a resolution with China, the EU will impose additional tariffs of up to 38% on electric vehicles imported from China starting next month, with implementation expected around July 4th. The European Commission specified that BYD will face tariffs of 17%, Geely 20%, and SAIC Group at 38%, while other manufacturers will incur a 21% tariff. Given the cost and price advantages of Chinese electric vehicles, it is estimated that tariffs will need to rise to 40 to 50% to be effective. Otherwise, Chinese electric vehicles will maintain their price advantage. It's not just electric vehicles. Chinese-made fuel cars are also achieving significant sales worldwide. For instance, over 70% of Chery's exports are fuel cars. Both Western automakers and consumers must be prepared for Chinese cars to replace Western ones. China has learned a lot from decades of collaboration with German car companies. It was only a matter of time before the student surpassed the master. While Westerners, with their political system and comprehensive social welfare, enjoy life, many Chinese, under long-term authoritarian rule, work hard to secure their livelihood. With unrivaled cost control in manufacturing and substantial state subsidies, China is irreplaceable in global manufacturing. In response to the EU's preliminary ruling on anti-subsidy investigations, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce stated that the European Commission disregards the fact that China's electric vehicle advantage stems from open competition, ignores WTO rules, and China's comprehensive cooperation in the investigation. The ministry called the artificially high subsidy figures blatant protectionism, exacerbating trade friction under the guise of maintaining fair competition. Reportedly, China and the EU met in Brussels on June 3rd for a hearing on the anti-subsidy investigation. Chinese companies were informed of the issue at this hearing, but the tariff rates were not disclosed. According to the South China Morning Post, affected Chinese companies are seeking legal advice on the EU's proposed tariffs. Analysts suggest that these temporary tariffs will significantly impact Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, adding billions of dollars in costs. Next, the European Commission will negotiate with Chinese automakers and EU member states, with temporary tariffs potentially becoming permanent by early November. The president of the European Commission will be talking with Beijing about subsidies for the electric vehicle industry during this time. In May, the current president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said she would discuss with Beijing how to stop the unfair treatment that European car makers face in competition. She also stressed that it's important to avoid a trade war. Currently, there are some changing factors in the relationship between China and Europe. In a recent interview with Bloomberg TV, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman said that Chinese leaders prefer to use more government spending to support production rather than consumer demand, which he finds quite strange. Krugman stated, "We can't absorb. The world will not accept everything China wants to export." The other shoe has finally dropped. The EU has imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The tariff rates aren't that high, but their impact is significant. Without these tariffs, the remaining Chinese electric vehicle companies would surely flood the market. Besides electric vehicles, China continues to increase exports of other manufactured goods due to domestic economic slowdown and a sluggish real estate market, leading to surpluses in steel, cement, solar panels, and other products. Even some South American countries are imposing tariffs on Chinese steel, with others planning to follow suit. The US has long expressed dissatisfaction with trade imbalances with China, claiming that China exports too much and imports too little, resulting in a high trade deficit. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and other officials criticized China's overcapacity. However, Beijing denies this and instead claims that it is because foreign companies are not as competitive as Chinese companies. U.S. Ambassador to Japan Rahm Emanuel stated this week that Beijing's subsidies to manufacturing are causing problems for all neighboring countries, For the EU, the newly elected European Parliament members taking office in mid-July will confirm or revise the June 12th announcement within 4 months. Therefore, the recent election results could significantly impact China-EU geopolitical and economic relations. Similarly, von der Leyen's future is also under scrutiny. She needs to secure re-election and be reappointed as president. Moreover, whether Beijing will immediately retaliate or continue to pressure EU countries to oppose the final permanent tariffs remains uncertain. Following the US's announcement of a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, Europe has become an attractive market for Chinese car companies such as BYD, Geely, and Great Wall Motors. In 2023, Chinese brands sold over 350,000 cars and SUVs in Europe, primarily electric vehicles. SAIC Group's MG brand led the market with 239,000 electric vehicles sold, nearly double the total sales of 2022. BYD sold approximately 16,000 electric vehicles in Europe in 2023 and is actively promoting sales there. The company has announced plans to build a factory in Hungary to localize electric vehicle production. HSBC research noted Chinese manufacturers are rapidly growing in Europe, with their electric vehicle market share doubling to 7% last year. We expect it to reach 10% by 2025. Investment research firm Evercore ISI reported earlier in 2024 that Chinese automakers have an annual production capacity of 40 million vehicles, with domestic sales at 30 million. This drives China to actively search for new markets overseas. Evercore ISI predicts that by 2030, China will account for 10% of Europe's electric vehicle sales. Chinese commentator Zhang Tianliang said on his show that the EU's reasoning is that their investigation found importing electric vehicles from China is harming Europe's automotive industry. This situation reminds us of the 2018 trade war between Trump and Xi Jinping. Initially, the Chinese Communist Party didn't take it seriously, thinking they could tear up the contract after signing it. Trump got very angry and increased tariffs from 10 to 25%, which forced many Chinese factories to relocate. A lot of foreign companies moved their production lines to other countries. Now, the EU is doing the same thing Trump did. Back then, Trump's tariff hikes were criticized by many European countries who believed in free trade. But now, they are experiencing the pain of getting dumped by the CCP, especially with electric vehicles. The European electric vehicle industry hasn't even fully developed yet, and it's already being flooded by imports from China. Chinese electric cars are cheap, with prices as low as $10,000, while even the most affordable models in Europe usually start at around $27,000. In 2023, Allianz Trade, a subsidiary of the German insurance company Allianz, stated that by 2030, unless the EU takes action to raise tariffs, enhance battery and other technologies, or persuade China to manufacture cars in Europe, Chinese-made electric vehicles could cost European automakers 7 billion euros, around $7.7 billion in annual profits. The automotive industry is crucial for employment in Europe. According to the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, the industry provides direct and indirect jobs for 13 million Europeans, including 2.4 million manufacturing positions. Facing tariff barriers from the US and EU, the CCP might seek recourse at the World Trade Organization. However, with the WTO in a semi-paralyzed state, there is little chance of success, and it is unlikely to change the stances of the US and EU. The CCP's strategy seems to be setting up factories directly in target countries to produce and sell locally, bypassing tariff barriers. This approach is similar to the strategies used by Japanese and South Korean car manufacturers. When Japanese cars flooded into the US, the big three American automakers struggled to compete due to the Japanese cars' affordability, reliability, and fuel efficiency. Eventually, US government intervention forced Japanese companies to shift from direct exports to local manufacturing. Today, most Japanese brands like Toyota and Honda are manufactured by American workers in the US, though they carry Japanese names. South Korean cars like Kia and Hyundai follow a similar path, manufacturing locally in the US for the past 2 decades. Recently, the official from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, Wang Wentao, made a high-profile speech at a joint venture electric vehicle factory in Spain, attempting to influence the EU. He also visited the electric vehicle plant jointly established by China's Chery Automobile and Spain's Ebro. Chinese car companies are gearing up to establish factories in Hungary, aiming to produce directly in Europe and enter the EU market. By building joint venture factories in Spain and Hungary, China seeks not only to bypass EU sanctions, but also to divide European countries. China's strategy in the automotive industry is modeled after the successful tactics used by Japanese and South Korean companies in the US market. However, it's ultimately still copying from other countries and generally hard to replicate their success. Why is that? Because it involves a political risk. The decoupling and risk avoidance measures between Europe, the US, and China will make it hard for Chinese-made cars and electric vehicles to replicate the success of Japan and Korea. Moreover, while Chinese products are cheap, their quality is often questionable. In Western societies, Chinese-made products are typically associated with poor quality, short lifespans, counterfeiting, and inadequate after-sales service. Additionally, to maintain their price advantage, Chinese car brands manufacturing and selling in the West would need to import many components from China, following the offshoring model. Yet, this model, which was popular 10 to 20 years ago, is no longer viable. Instead, friend-shoring and ally-shoring is the new trend. This also aligns with Western policy to reduce dependence on adversarial nations. Friend-shoring is a policy promoted by the US government, encouraging companies to relocate operations from geopolitically conflicted countries to allied nations. This policy aims to create a new, resilient supply chain network among friendly nations. Naturally, the new US supply chain network excludes Chinese companies, leading to a manufacturing shift from China to Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and India. The concept of friend-shoring was introduced by Bonnie Glick, the former deputy administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. She initially used the term allied shoring to describe this future international economic strategy. In April 2022, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen publicly mentioned friend-shoring for the first time. By June 2022, the White House released a report on building resilient supply chains, formally adopting allied and friend-shoring in discussing future U.S. supply chain policies. Canada was the first to respond to the U.S. call. Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland urged Western countries to actively embrace the concept of friend-shoring and reduce trade with authoritarian regimes. A joint survey by a French business association and agile buyer consulting company found that nearly half of French companies are considering shifting their supply sources, with India likely to benefit most from this supply chain shift. An article in Foreign Policy magazine argues that the world is gradually splitting into two opposing blocs, and businesses will increasingly be unable to ignore geopolitical risks. As the U.S. tightens restrictions on Chinese goods, many Chinese factories have invested in Mexico to circumvent U.S. tariffs by labeling Chinese products as made in Mexico. However, just last month, the Mexican government imposed temporary import tariffs of 5 to 50% on 544 items, including steel, aluminum, and textiles, to protect domestic industries and prevent unfair competition. This move hampers Chinese companies' attempts to use Mexico as a backdoor to the U.S. market. Can Chinese automakers replicate the success of Japanese and Korean companies by investing in U.S. factories? Firstly, investing in U.S. manufacturing would not help China's own manufacturing sector escape economic difficulties. Secondly, this would mean capital outflow from China, which contradicts the Chinese government's foreign exchange strategy. Thirdly, the friend-shoring strategy prevents Chinese companies in the U.S. from sourcing components from China. Chinese electric vehicles produced in the U.S. would have to use American labor, driving up costs and losing their price advantage. Additionally, it remains uncertain whether Chinese electric vehicles can meet U.S. crash, safety, and energy standards. Achieving this would increase costs, making it hard to compete with other brands in the U.S. market. Therefore, while China's strategies for economic breakthroughs appear feasible on paper, they are fraught with practical difficulties and are unlikely to replicate the success of Japanese and Korean car companies. China wants to do business and make money from foreigners, but at the same time, they also act aggressively and make enemies all around. This approach of trying to have it both ways is bound to end up being a wasted effort.